This is American TV with Mitchell Hadley, and we are going to do a show now on Sid and Marty Krofft, the Krofft brothers who dominated the late 60s to the 1970s with non-animated shows, and we'll be back in a moment to speak about it. So we are back. We just finished a show talking about Hanna-Barbera cartoons and Saturday morning. Now we're going to go on to their sort of human counterparts, Sid and Marty Krofft. Before we do that, let me just introduce Mitchell Hadley. Mitch, if you could give a little background about who you are.
Good to be with you again, Dan. I am a classic TV historian and looking at the relationship between classic television programs and American historical and popular culture. I write about that on itsabouttv.com. I've authored 3 books, the most recent of which is The Electronic Mirror, which talks about classic television and how it tells us about who we were and who we are.
Well, we just finished a show talking about the Hanna-Barbera creative team, and we were talking about them being on sort of the Mount Rushmore of animation. When we talk about Sid and Marty Krofft and live action Saturday morning stuff, there is no Mount Rushmore. It's them, basically. They are the mountain.
Yes, they have such a unique style and a unique blend of living cartoons, I suppose you would call them. You know, they're puppets, they're people in costumes, but this ability that they had to be able to combine live characters with characters that are animated in every sense except that there are people inside the costume. It's a very unique blend. You know, it's hard to describe, but they are almost singular in their ability to be able to do that.
Now, I mentioned their names as Sid and Marty Krofft, which initially led me to think that they were Jewish, because the 2 F's in Krofft would seem that. But those are actually not their real names. Their real names was Sidis and Mashopopoulos Yolis.
I'm glad you did that.
Mashopopoulos. Yeah, I think I got it right. So probably we'd have to talk, if we're going back before the Kroffts got started, probably maybe in the 50s and 60s, the closest thing to a progenitor to them might have been the Henson puppets that later, became famous on Sesame Street. There was, because those were puppets that interacted with human beings.
Yes.
Yet we had, there was some non-costumed human beings that interacted in the shows for the Kroffts there, but they seem to take that sort of to a whole new level. And so if you can, just give a little background on the brothers and how they rose to fame.
Sure. Well, they were Canadian. They were born in Montreal. Sid was born 1929. Marty was born in 37. Sid is actually still alive. Marty just died a little over a year ago. So they started out as puppeteers. Their father was a clock salesman, and they had worked in the circus. They had done work with different studios, and they had worked on puppet shows that were geared toward adults more than children. So they had, from the start, a very unique skill, a very unique talent that they were going to be applying. And apropos of the fact that we just finished talking about Hanna-Barbera, Sid and Marty Krofft actually worked with Hanna-Barbera on a series we hadn't talked about called the Banana Splits. Yeah. They had designed the characters and sets for that series, and then they moved into doing their own shows. And I don't always like to use direct quotes of descriptions, but there was a description of at YouTube, not YouTube, I think it was Wikipedia, that described best what they did, and it's too good to not use. It says their fantasy programs often featured large-headed puppets, high-concept plots, and extensive use of low-budget special effects. That is, I think, the best description that I could possibly come up with for describing what they did. Their first successful show on their own after working on the Banana Splits with Hanna-Barbera, their first show was H.R. Pufnstuf, which was on in 1969. And it has a typical formula for a Krofft show. You had a young boy, a teenager, or in some cases teenagers, but you have a concept of a teenager who becomes part of an alternate world, a fantasy world, and that he's more or less in that world, and so he interacts with that world and with the characters in that world, and that we see in almost every one of the classic Krofft shows. So they hewed very closely to that formula, and it was very successful for them. With Pufnstuf, that character itself is kind of interesting because they had created Pufnstuf for the World's Fair in San Antonio in 1968. And there were people, because of the bright, vivid, funky colors that they used in their shows, they were on videotape, they had very funky type graphics, very much of the time. And people suggested that they had been influenced by marijuana and LSD.
Yeah.
And they denied that, always denied that. I don't remember if it was Sid or Marty that had said, never drugs while we were working on a program. After, maybe, but never during. So they never did anything like that. But there is a psychedelica to those shows that makes them extremely distinctive in the time period.
Well, I just want to talk about the Banana Split since we didn't mention it in the Hanna-Barbera show, but I remember that one was like 1 banana, 2 banana, 3 banana, 4 bananas playing the Banana Splits when they were tra-la-la-la. And not only was the convergence of Hanna-Barbera and the Kroffts, but you also had the influence of the Monkees. This was the kids' version of the Monkees because you had a little baby elephant, you had a gorilla, you had a dog, and you had, let's see, the gorilla, the dog, and then I guess it was a lion, a skinny lion. So you had those 4, and then now I think it might have only been a half hour, was it an hour show? You would have them with live skits, which were very Monkees-like, and then also I think they were animated too.
Yes, and that's the thing. If you look at the Banana Splits in isolation, anybody familiar with the Kroffts' work would certainly have thought that was a Sid and Marty Krofft show and not a Hanna-Barbera show, because it's really bridging from the animation of Hanna-Barbera into the live action. It has kind of the broad characters that Hanna-Barbera enjoyed using, but it is the style and the content and the look that the Krofts became famous for.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about Pufnstuf because that, along with one other show later, I want to talk about as being sort of their 2 benchmark shows. You had first off, there was the Peter, Paul, and Mary song, Puff the Magic Dragon. And then that was just a couple of years before Pufnstuf debuted. And not only with the LSD, but Pufnstuf himself, because there are lots of episodes, there's only 17 episodes, but probably maybe 4 or 5 episodes, where something gets sprayed from a witchy poo or from a flower, and you get the sense that they are acting high, like they have just smoked some weed. So you had that as well. Plus, two other points. The first one I want to get your comment on. It was in maybe 71, 72, a year or two after Puff and Stuff first started airing, and like the Hanna-Barbera stuff, a lot of these shows they just did 17, 18 episodes and whatnot. But there was a major lawsuit between Krofft, the Krofft brothers, and McDonald's over the use of the then McDonald's characters, like the Hamburglar and the cheeseburger head, or whatever they called it. They were very similar to the Krofft characters from Puff and Stuff. Was that seems to be a very unique lawsuit there? Do you know anything about them?
Well, that certainly it doesn't come as a surprise when you look at those characters, and when you look at the colors and the way that they interact. It sure looks like that, you know. And they claimed that that it was a copyright violation, that McDonald's had impinged on them. It actually goes back to, they had been approached by an advertising agency with Needham, Harper, and Steers as to whether or not they'd be interested in working for on a campaign for McDonald's based on the Puff and Stuff characters. And they were going to go ahead with it, and then McDonald's supposedly canceled the campaign. And yet when it went ahead with the McDonaldland characters, some of the sets, costumes, voices were people who had worked on Puff and Stuff or worked with the Crofts, and so they were clearly based on them. I don't know if you could say that they were legally based on them, but they clearly, you know, the eye test shows that they were. And because of that, the Crofts weren't able to license any spin-off products from Puff and Stuff. And the Ice Capades, for example, they had a deal with the Ice Capades, and then the Ice Capades decided to use the McDonaldland characters instead. And so this is where in 1971 they sue. And the jury agreed with them at $50,000 in damages. It was appealed. It goes into 1977, I think, that it finally winds up being settled, and they ruled for the Crofts again. They looked specifically at Mayor McCheese and Puff and Stuff, and found enough similarities that they were able to reject the list of differences the characters had, and the types of locales, the similarities, the anthropomorphic world type of thing, that this was, you know, a landmark case in a way, based on setting a certain kind of precedent, that they hadn't ripped off the characters themselves. They hadn't used Puff and Stuff without permission, but they had used characters that were similar enough to them in the reaction that they would produce from people seeing them, that it amounted to what they would call substantial similarity. And that's why the jury wound up ruling for them, and that's why the Court of Appeals upheld that.
Yeah, Mayor McCheese and Puff and Stuff was the mayor of Living Island. I think it was the Living Island it was called.
Yes.
But also it also has something in common with the Brady Bunch, is that, like the Brady Bunch, a later film was made of it. Once it was about a year into it, it was closer than the Brady Bunch movies, which were 20 years later. But also, there have been plays there have been Broadway or off-Broadway productions of Puff and Stuff where the original one or two of the shows are put together and they are read by characters, just like they did with the Brady Bunch. So it had a huge cultural impact for something that only lasted a year or two.
Yep. Well, and that, we talked about this with the Jetsons when we were talking about Hanna-Barbera. The idea that there were only 17 episodes of Puff and Stuff made, and yet it had that lasting appeal to the point where it was, voted in the top 30 of the greatest Saturday morning kid shows of all time, just on the basis of those original 17 episodes and the life that they took on of their own is it's quite remarkable, and it is a testimonial to their ability to be able to create characters that made that kind of an impression on people.
Now, the human character was played by Jack Wilde, who was coming off an Oscar turn from Oliver, and it began I guess you call it tradition of the Krofft brothers taking people who were considered over the hill or odd in some way and using them in their shows, because one of the shows, Lidsville, took Butch Patrick, who had played Eddie Munster, and sent him into a world of living hats.
Yeah, and if that wasn't enough, Charles Nelson Riley was in it too. So, yeah, and you're right. I mean, Johnny Whitaker was Sigmund. Sigmund?
Yeah, Sigmund and the Sea Monsters.
And then when you look at Land of the Lost, what's interesting about that is that you had one of the actors who was in Land of the Lost was actually oh gosh, what was his name?
Wesley Ewer?
What's that?
Wesley Ewer?
No,
Spencer Milligan?
No, the one that I'm actually thinking of is when Wesley Ewer, or I'm sorry, when for the third and final season, when the father.
Oh yeah, Ron Harper.
Yeah, when you look at Ron Harper, and he had been in many TV series.
Planet of the Apes, one of my favorite failed shows from the 70s.
Garrison's Gorillas, which I loved him in that. 87th Precinct, another great show that he was in. So he also falls into that category of kind of a quasi-reclamation project.
Yeah, and also, too, there was, speaking of the Banana Splits, they tried another musical show, The Bugaloos, which was sort of a band of British bugs who, instead of being monkeys, was supposedly really bugs. And they, too, had an antagonist that, I forget whether it was a full-on witch or something, or maybe it was a war, maybe Charles Nelson Riley was a warlock with the Lidsville. I don't remember. But you would often have shows. They either had old recycled stars, or they'd have cute babes. I remember the female bug was like, they actually released a record here in the U.S. and it didn't go anywhere. But those two shows, they didn't have any great cultural impact. But then I think Sigmund and the Sea Monsters was, I think, after Puff and Stuff, the next show that had some semblance of real popularity, and it may have only lasted, again, a season or two, but because it had Johnny Whitaker from A Family Affair, and it had a catchy opening song and premise, and it used Billy Barty, who is one of the most famous dwarf actors of the last century. I think it gained some traction culturally for kids.
Yeah, and I think that it also had this concept that children are able to identify with, is the bullied kid. In the case of Sigmund, he had been cast. He was a cast out because he refused to frighten people. So right there, you already have kind of a Casper the Friendly Ghost kind of overtone, but you do have a character that is very accessible to children who understand this idea of being outcasts or pariahs or something like that. And he's a likable character, so that's not surprising that kids would be drawn to that. And you're right that of all the Krofft shows, that was the first one they did that ran more than one season. You go to these others, you go to Lidsville, the Bugaloos, Puffin stuff. They all ran for one season. Sigmund ran for 2 seasons, so that's the first time they had a show that went more than just the single season.
And then we get to what I would consider I guess you'd call it the Citizen Kane of the Krofft empire, and that's Land of the Lost, which differed from the other ones, because the other ones were clearly meant to be just for cheap jokes or cheap laughs. They had a very vaudeville type humor, but then you get the Land of the Lost, and now you're into something that's in some ways philosophical. You're dealing with a family in distress, and there are some episodes where the kids are missing their mothers. The story being that their father is a park ranger, I guess, in the Grand Canyon. I don't think it's ever mentioned specifically, but they're rafting down the canyon, and then all of a sudden the earth opens up. They fall down, but they don't fall into the center of the earth. They somehow transmute into some weird vortex in time and space with dinosaurs and aliens and futuristic, and you have the Sleestack, the future Sleestack, which are ignorant, and there's the ancient Sleestack. I forget the guy's name, Enoch, I think, who is intelligent. There are some really engaging concepts, and it's very well acted by all involved. What is your take on that? Because to me, that's the crown jewel of.
Yes. It's a much darker story than any of the others. And as you said, it doesn't have the slapstick elements. It has, again, something that I think children can understand is this fear of being lost, whether it's lost from your family, being on your own, or lost from your own time. I think that's something that children feel they're both excited by and afraid of it. And it has special effects that are, a little cheesy today, but they weren't bad for the time, and especially for a kid's show. And there is a website out there where the author is reviewing Land of the Lost episodes on an episode-by-episode basis and talking about them, and is very impressed with the quality of the acting and the stories. And I think when you look at the people who were involved with that show, I mean, you have a lot of people from Star Trek who were involved in it. You have a lot of quality science fiction writers, Theodore Sturgeon, Ben Bova, Larry Niven.
DC Fontana from Star Trek.
Yep, and Walter Koenig, David Gerrold. So you've got people who know their stuff. And there are 2 ways you can go about with time travel when you're thrown either forward or back into a time that is not your own. You can either choose to play it for high camp, or you can do a serious take on it, and either one of them can work. But if you're going to do them, whichever one you choose to do, you'd better get it right. And they did get it right with Land of the Lost. They spent the time on the writers. They had the quality that was that was going into the stories. And you had this unique situation in that there are really 2 or 3 different overarching themes. You have the most important one is the idea of getting back to their own time and their own place. And this is at the forefront of everything that they're doing. But at the same time, you also have to explore the place that you're at. You meet the inhabitants, you meet the different elements of this place, and that's an adventure that you're going on even while you're trying to get back. And then you also have the third element, which is simply survival. And it's sort of like Lost in Space in that sense, in that you're trying to get home, but you're not overlooking the fact that there is still an aspect of adventure involved in all of this, and particularly the first two seasons. It ran 3 seasons altogether. The first 2 seasons particularly have this grittier, darker aspect. In the 3rd season, where you have the change in casting, you have Spencer Milligan, who plays the
Rick.
father. Yep. And he falls through a portal back to his own time.
Yeah.
And he's almost instantly replaced by was an uncle. His brother. This uncle to the kids, who had been out searching for them, and he winds up taking the father's place. That's I remember when that happened, when I was watching it in its first run, being immensely confused by that concept of how one of them could trigger the other one falling back in time. It's a very interesting technique, but I think most people would agree that that the 3rd season probably is not up to the level of the first 2, but it still manages as a Saturday morning kid show to hold its own as a credible drama.
Yeah, you mentioned Lost in Space, and I'd say it's got more in common with season 1 of Lost in Space rather than the later 2 seasons.
Yeah, the black and white
it never
season,
devolves. It never devolves into ooh, Doctor Whoops, Dr. Smith.
No, if they had had Charles Nelson Riley on it, that might have been a different story. But you're right. It's. I think that the reason when you talk about it being the Citizen Kane of the Krofft oeuvre, I think that the reason is because it is always played absolutely straight. You look at this and you say, what would you do if you were in a position like that? And most of the decisions are operate on a level of logic and common sense that you can understand. Well, if you're put in this fantastical situation, then it makes sense that this is what you would do.
Now, the thing that I found interesting, even then and then later on, is some of the philosophical aspects. It's got very much the Hindu idea of cyclical time. For example, season 1 ends with the family escaping, but another version of themselves ends up, and the family in season 2 are doppelgangers of the family from season 1. Then, as you mentioned, the father and his brother switch places at the end of season 2. There's an episode, I forget the name of them, where Holly meets a grown-up version of herself, or they're pretty sure it's a grown-up version, who's come back to warn her about something. Enoch, who is, there are these tall, gangly, pointy-headed, green reptilian things called the Sleestack, which look quite a bit like sort of the modern UFO mythos of the sexual pervert gray aliens, except that these are green. And it's throughout the episode, or throughout the first season or 2, Enoch believes that these are his ancestors, yet it turns out that Enoch was the ancestor and his civilization has fallen, and he resigns himself to living in this time and trying to teach his countrymen to rise up again.
Yeah, it's a very existential concept, and it's not simply a science fiction trope. I mean, the idea of doppelgangers and meeting your future self, when that can be kind of a hoary cliche or a trope. But when you look at it in a series like The Twilight Zone, for example, Serling almost always is getting at something when he introduces that, and the same goes here. That you're talking about more than simply a plot device. device. You're talking about something that is dealing with the meaning of life on multiple levels, and the organic development of things. And you're right, this cyclical time and multiple time paths, and you're combining existentialism and science fiction is a really good blend.
Yeah. And two other points before we move on. I remember there was also an episode where they climb to the top of a mountain and they're looking through binoculars and they can see their own backs because it circles around. They called it a pocket universe. And I don't recall, maybe you do. Did the series ever have a final episode, or was that left open-ended?
I think that it was left open-ended. If I'm remembering it correctly, they never get back.
Yeah.
And so
well, the second family, because remember,
yes,
yeah, the second.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But I think so. It is open-ended in that point that I not to say that it precludes them from ever getting back, but they didn't then. And when they made the big screen version of it and tried to make it into a comedy, and the less said about that kind of thing, the better, because that is turning it into camp.
Yeah.
And you could have done that with some of the other Krofft shows, but most assuredly, Land of the Lost was not camp.
And then we get, speaking of UFOs, we get The Lost Saucer with Jim Nabors and Ruth Buzzy as
another recycling of yep.
And I guess the only catch here was that it was the first black child who was the lead. I forget the name of the actor who was kidnapped by the aliens. Or they come to he's on the UFO.
Jared Johnson.
Yeah, and then I don't even remember what it was. It was at that point, I would say, the worst that the Krofft had offered. It seemed to be pointless.
Yeah, it is a variation on the typical formula, but it is a return to the kind of shows that they were doing previously. Maybe not as creative, because you're not using these large-headed puppet costumed characters, but to that extent. But you've got a slight variation on it, because what happens is you've got Ruth Buzzy and Jim Nabors, two aliens, and they're the ones who are lost.
Yeah.
But and these kids come aboard the ship, and the aliens are afraid they're attracting attention, so they decide they'd better get out of there, and they take off with the kids on board. But then something happens, and the ship becomes something like the TARDIS, in that they're not able to control where or when it goes, and so they wind up all being refugees, if you will. And it's an interesting concept. I think you could have, if they had gone more seriously with it, you might have had a different show. But I would agree that in the overall look at their work, it's kind of a moot point.
Now, interestingly, the next show that they did was called Electra Woman and Dyna Girl, and it starred a longtime soap opera actress
Deirdre Hall.
Yeah. But I found that apparently this was a very, very popular show for young women, that they found it to be very empowering. I always, at the time, when I'd have been 10 or 11, thought it was a ripoff of a show that was a year or two earlier called Isis.
Yes.
Which had Joanna Cameron, and that was, I think, paired with Shazam. That was separate from the Kroffts, but
that was also a very popular show.
But apparently, after Puff and Stuff and Land of the Lost, this is the show that most people, even more so than Sigmund, most women at least of my age or your age group, look back on fondly with.
Yeah, positive role models, empowered women. It doesn't hurt that they are both attractive, but I think that the main point of it is that you've got female superheroes, which in mainstream Saturday morning shows, other than somebody like Wonder Woman or a few of those, they're still a rarity, and in live action work even more so. And what's particularly interesting about that is that it was part of the Krofft Super Show, but it was not a standalone. But it was actually one of the segments of the show that was replaced after a year by another element. So it didn't even have that long a run, but it did make a huge impact on the female viewers.
And then there was Wonderbug, which was another show that apparently was one of the longer lasting, did 2 or 3 seasons. And then you mentioned the Krofft Super Show, which is sort of like the live action version of the Laugh Olympics. You had what was it, Captain Cool and the Kongs, and they were I guess going back to the Banana Splits or the Bugaloos. There were trying to mix music, and I think it was Michael Lembeck who was Captain Cool. Who later became a well-known TV director, but
and then they were replaced by the Bay City Rollers, which was a real group in the 3rd season, and they have different segments. They have different characters, and you're right. It's a conglomeration of things.
Now just to give a little bit of. Show some of the way they were stretching. I do remember the Bigfoot and Wild Boy was a segment of the Krofft Super Show, and that seemed to me to be again a little bit more serious. I think it wasn't nearly as good as Land of the Lost, but I think that was something trying to show, because I believe the boy had been raised by Bigfoot, and they became sort of like a superhero team within their little universe.
Yeah, an interesting concept.
Yeah. So before we do get on to some of the later stuff, probably the most infamous, even more so some of the other stuff, had to be when the Kroffts did both the Brady Bunch Hour and then Pink Lady and Jeff, 2 of the most notoriously bad shows, and these were primetime shows. These are sort of the Plan 9 from outer space of television.
Yep, they did. They also did Barbara Mandrell's series with the Mandrell sisters, and they did Donnie and Marie. So they had a couple of successes, but all that goodwill probably gets undone with the Brady Bunch Hour and Pink Lady and Jeff, because those are like the Hindenburg of the if Land of the Lost is the Citizen Kane, these 2 are the Hindenburg of their resume.
And it should be said that Pink Lady was a very popular duo in Japan. They were sort of the female version of the Righteous Brothers of Japan. And to pair them with a middling comedian when they barely understood English, it's just one of the most odd concepts. Forget about the show was doomed just from the concept.
Yeah. Well, remember though that this is the same network that tries to sell people on Supertrain at this point in time. So. There's a lot going on at NBC at that point in time, but I don't think that there is any rational explanation for doing this show. It has "What Were You Thinking" written all over it.
Yeah, but after a few years of settling down, it looks like the Kroffts then tried to get serious again, because. I do remember the show from the late 80s, and that's DC Follies, where they did puppets of Tip O'Neill and Reagan and George H.W. Bush and the other leaders of that era, and other pop celebrities that would meet at this bar called, I think the bar was called DC Follies, and the puppets would meet there and they would talk about this, and it was a more sophisticated, more adult version of there were the 2 characters that were in the bleacher seats of the Kermit.
Waldorf,
yeah.
You're right. It's a satire. It is Fred Willard, who is very well cast in that series as the bartender. For for people who are old-time radio buffs, I would draw a comparison between it and Duffy's Tavern. Duffy's Tavern was a popular radio comedy where you had a bartender who was not Duffy. Duffy owned the place, but you had various celebrities who, for one reason or another, would find themselves in Duffy's Tavern. And so you have the interaction between the regulars and the celebrities, and you also have the interaction between the various regular characters. But I think it has some similarity to that, and it's certainly similar to Spitting Image, which was the British series that had the satirical series with puppets as well. But I think DC Follies makes a good representation, ran for a couple of seasons, and it was something that was more sophisticated and more adult. And I think that something like that, I would say that that's a concept that you could certainly bring back today. It was a nice complement to a show like The Muppet Show, which was earlier, but was in the same vein.
And I think DC Follies also followed a lot of the formula that Cheers had. They had regulars at the bar that were not the political faces that would make comments. You know, if Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill came in and they were drinking, you know, some puppet who in the back would, you know, boo them or whatever the deal was, Iraq or Panama or whatever country we were invading back then.
Yeah, and so that. You know, that was a successful series. There was another series that they did that around that same time, which was not as successful, but is very interesting. It was called Pryor's Place. And it was a children's show with Richard Pryor, who is not the first name that would come to mind if you were thinking about a host of a kids show. But it's a cross, I think, between Sesame Street and Fat Albert, because you've got this inner city neighborhood, this environment, and you've got kids that are interacting with Pryor and puppets, and then you have different characters that Pryor is playing. So it's like Sesame Street, except he's all of the characters. And it's like Fat Albert.
I was just going to mention that, yeah.
Yep. So, you know, that didn't run for that long.
Yeah.
But it's a very interesting concept, and it's a very very unique casting. But it oddly worked in a way too.
So let's talk a little bit before we talk about the Krofft brothers and what happened to their empire. Let's just speak a little bit, as we did some of the voice actors for Hanna-Barbera. Who are some of the standout actors within some of these shows for you? I mean, if you were to pick the 2 or 3 actors that stood out, that this is their moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think for me, Charles Nelson Riley in Lidsville created. You know, he had been on The Ghost and Mrs. Muir.
Yeah.
And he would go on to be on Match Game.
Yeah.
And I think Lidsville is where the character, all of the different qualities that you are going to see in Match Game come together. For me, if you're talking about the prototypical Charles Nelson Riley character, I think that's it. Because on Match Game, he's playing himself. Yeah. But that character, I think, comes from Lidsville. So I always think about him when I think about these. And I guess the other character that the characters that I think about probably as individuals are when we talk about Puffin stuff, the credibility that you had by putting an Academy Award nominated actor into that, I think, gave the show a certain acting credibility that that you kind of have to admire. I mean, Jack Wilde, it had, as you said, had been very successful in Oliver, been nominated for Best Supporting Actor, and so it was interesting to see him doing a stint on a kids show like this. But then Billy Hayes, of course, as Witchy Pooh,
Yeah.
I I think that she just steals every scene that she's in,
Yeah.
and it's impossible to see her in that and to not think of that role every time you think of her, or when you think of Puff and Stuff, to think of her.
Yeah.
I think those, for me, those are the characters that really stand out. I think that there are others, as you mentioned, Johnny Whitaker, Butch Patrick, a lot of these people along the line that you remember. But I think that these, for me, are the most memorable characters, the
Well,
ones that really create an impression on you.
yeah, Wild, Butch Patrick, Whitaker, they all
Hmm.
ended up, I think, in drug rehab at some point.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
not that this was a problem unique to the Crofts,
Oh
but
no,
in the
no. I mean
60s and 70s.
that's a problem that is not unique to child actors at all.
Yeah.
I think it's much easier to name the ones who didn't wind up in a situation like that.
Uh, I just also, before we move on and talk about the end of the Krofft reign. I saw that Paul Lynde also did a Halloween special, and it's interesting because you mentioned Charles Nelson Riley. I, Paul Lynde would have been a natural in a Krofft kind of
Yes, he
show.
would have. He would have been superb in something like that. Rather than the Paul Lynde show that he wound up in,
Yeah.
I think he would have been wonderful in a Krofft show.
Yeah, because let's face it, the Crofts, the flamboyance, the weird costumes, the weird characters, you always get a sense that their character, that this uh, it's never explicit, but because Riley and Lynn were both obviously out there gay men,
Hmm.
there's a flamboyant gayness to a lot of this universe, whether it's the wild colors, whether it's the flowers, whether it's characters skipping around and doing weird things. It gives to this sort of overall flamboyance of what people would think of drag shows. There's a very John Waters kind of similarity to some of the
Hmm.
Croft.
Yeah, and you combine it with the material in the shows, which is very corny, corny, old-fashioned sketch comedy within this psychedelic environment. You mentioned the Monkees earlier, and I think that that's a really good comparison to a lot of the Krofft programs, even the ones that don't even resemble them in terms of plot or anything like that, still are representative of the tone.
Yeah.
And I think that it's a show, and I say this in a good way, it's a show that's very much of its time. The graphics, the costumes, the colors, you're never going to mistake them for any time except the late 60s up to the mid 70s. That
Yeah.
if you were to take somebody and try to explain to them what that era was like, this is a pretty good thing to be able to show them.
So let us talk about the end of the empire with Hanna-Barbera. Basically, new creators came along, new opportunities, new avenues. It seems though that none of that existed for the Crofts. By the early '80s, I don't. What was the last one they did that was a Saturday morning show was Wonderbug, which ended in '78,
Yeah.
and pretty much that's the curtain on that. Yes, they did some of these specials. They did, DC Follies later on, but there was no way to return to a Puff and Stuff to be relevant in the 2000s.
No, it really is interesting that when you look at their body of work after the highlights that we talked about, it's restricted mostly to either either variety shows. They did one with Bobby Vinton. They did one with Oral Roberts. And one with Patti LaBelle, so they were either working in that area or they were recycling old concepts, trying to do updated versions of some of their characters. They tried to do a revival of Electra Woman and Dyna Girl. They were involved tangentially in the 2009 Land of the Lost, but they got involved in other kinds of programming. They did some live shows. They had this disastrous attempt to get into the theme park business in 1976 when they worked on the World of Sid and Marty Krofft, which was an indoor amusement park that was going into the Omni Center in Atlanta, next to the whole complex with the sports arena and the hotel and different things like that. And that lasted 6 months before it closed.
Well, doesn't that also go back to the Banana Splits? Weren't the Banana Splits that filmed a lot of things at a park that just opened in 68 or 69?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it would have been a different park, but it was that concept, yes. And you can't help but notice the irony that the space that Sid and Marty Krofft, the World of Sid and Marty Krofft, it was in, wound up being CNN Center. You can make of that what you will, but that wound up being the headquarters for CNN when they were still located in Atlanta.
Mm-hmm. So
they just, that was it, though. That when to come back to your original point about what happened to them, they got involved in different kinds of programs and they tried to revive some of their standards. But that does seem to be it. Their last big success, I think, was probably DC Follies from that traditional standpoint. And after that, it just does kind of ease away. They've got Lifetime Achievement Awards from the Emmys. They've probably got a star on the Walk of Fame. There are conventions that are dedicated to looking back at their work. So they are well remembered. As you said, they are a singular type of act. But at some point, it does appear that you just petered out.
Yeah. And I know, Wesley, you're and Kathy Coleman, who played Will Marshall and Holly Marshall, are constantly doing the rounds at the, these sci-fi conventions with Star Trek and other actors like that. But we mentioned how Hanna-Barbera had a very good working relationship. They were not related. They were not. But the Krofft brothers apparently were a bit acrimonious. One of the Krofft brothers, Sid, sued Marty Krofft for lack of payment or something therein. What do we know? Were the brothers on good terms when was it Marty died first? Yeah.
Well, Sid died first, I think, because Marty's still alive.
No, it's on Wikipedia it says Marty died from kidney failure in 23 at 86. So I'm assuming it's Sid who's alive.
Yeah, you're right. I just switched them around there, but I don't know what their relationship was other than that lawsuit. But if you look at the lawsuit itself, it mentions something about Marty becoming aggressive and irrational when talking about their personal and financial relationship, and that there was kind of a seesaw nature to it. So it sounds to me like it was an up and down type of thing, and there was a definite contrast in the way the two brothers lived. Sid was the more frugal of the two. Marty had a more extravagant lifestyle, which ties into the lawsuit. And so, without actually having read anything that specifically addresses their relationship, just looking between the lines in the lawsuit suggests, I would think, a certain amount of volatility between the two of them.
So, legacy-wise, even though, Saturday morning television is not coming back, I do think that at some point, despite the disastrous, well, maybe not disastrous, Land of the Lost movie that was done with tongue-in-cheek a decade or more ago, I do think that perhaps the Crofts could have a second act. I mentioned how a lot of Land of Lost episodes have been given the Brady Bunch treatment, that have been, people have done sort of Second City kind of on-stage readings of some of the scripts. I'm thinking of like Electro Woman and Dyna Girl could possibly be made into a franchise, especially now in this day and age. And so those two, especially Land of the Lost and Electro Woman and Dyna Girl, might have some kind of truck in the future. But what is their legacy? Is there anyone now doing anything remotely like the Crofts are doing?
I think you could say that the Henson Company does something similar, in the sense that you're combining live humans with puppet-like characters. But as far as a regular thing on TV, I can't think of anything that is quite like what the Crofts were doing, because it was so large and so over the top and so broad and colorful. I don't think anybody is doing that kind of work anymore. And I think you're correct in talking about the shows that could be revived are those two, particularly Land of the Lost and Electro Woman, because they depend on the concept and the characters. I would hate to see, if you were going to do Lidsville or Puffin Stuff, the problem is somebody would get a hold of this, and I can just hear them saying, now think of it as, well, all the CGI and all the effects we can do. We can turn him into a real sea monster. Yeah. Sigmund can look just like something from the Outer Limits. Well, that's not what it's all about. Yeah. It's about fun, and
let's make Witchy Poo really dark. Maybe she really bakes children in pies or something.
Yeah, I think somebody said something once about one of these movie versions of a TV show, and I can't remember if it was Wild Wild West or Land of the Lost, or one of the others of that ilk, where they've turned out to be, satires, spoofs of this kind of thing. And the question really is, when you've got an intellectual property like this that only a select number of people remember, you go out of your way, it seems, in doing a spoof of them. You go out of your way to offend the very people that are the only people that bring any value to using an intellectual property in the first place. And I can just see that happening with a lot of these Krofft properties. So I think that Land of the Lost is ripe to be able to redo again, and Electro Woman and Dyna Girl. I think that the fact that they tried to do a pilot for Electro Woman in 2001 and it didn't go anywhere is proof that they saw that possibility as well.
And there was a Land of the Lost Saturday show in like 91 or 92, about 20 years after the original.
Yeah, so I think you can use the improved special effects to good in something like that, but you've got to be true to the concept, and you've got to be able to carry through what makes them good: the existentialism, the time travel, the darkness, the feeling of being lost. If you don't do that, it isn't going to work. And maybe nobody else could do what they did at that time. It may have been that they were the perfect people at the perfect time in the perfect place.
Well, that's a good way to end it. We will be back next month with another show talking about the history of television.